Alright, so here we go with our Chapter 6 review of Stephen King's It, the novel. The title of this chapter was One of the Missing, A Tale from the Summer of '58. You may have noticed that I did not put the title of this chapter in the title of this video. This is the first time I'm actually making this this way, and I've gone back and retroactively changed the titles of the other videos because I realized something, which was, say you don't know anything about this book and you want to go into it totally blind, well, if you see my videos recommended, then it may semi-spoil something from the book. It says one of the missing, and that means that there were probably people going missing, and I'm a person who likes to give people an opportunity to go into something totally blind if they so choose. So, especially since I share these videos in Facebook groups sometimes, I will no longer be including the chapter titles in the title of the video if I can help it, unless it's like some kind of interlude and there's no number and there's really no other way to distinguish it. So, that out of the way, I'll continue with the review now. So the first thing I'll say about this chapter is I'm getting pretty interested in the story. Stephen King's dropping in little hints here and there about what's going on, and we're getting just little pieces of the puzzle to help us figure out what's going on with the story. So that I do like. This chapter I don't think was too good on the scares. I mean, it had some creepy moments, but it was pretty high on the emotion. And like I said, not every single chapter has to have scares, but that is something I like about this book. But it was really high in the emotion department and also the character building. So the first thing is there is a lot of child abuse in this chapter, and later on some child death in this chapter, and it can be very draining if you're not in the mood to handle that kind of thing in a story. So right off the bat, we get a newspaper clipping about one child that has gone missing. And we find out later that this child was also the brother of a younger child who was murdered by his father. And his father went to jail for that and eventually committed suicide. The other child went missing, and the dad swears that he didn't do anything, and it turns out that the dad's right. But this child was killed by a monster. And this child was killed by a monster that first disguised itself as his younger brother. Dorsey is his name, his younger brother. And, he's sitting at the park at night. He runs away from his home, and the brother climbs over the edge of the canal there, the Kunduskig, and scares him, and he runs away and hits a tree and gets knocked out. And then he is chased by the Black Lagoon monster. And chased by the actual Black Lagoon, the whole thing. No, he's chased by the creature from the Black Lagoon, which I think it said he had watched at some point. And he convinces himself that, wait a minute, this can't hurt me. But it does, because it basically rips his head off. So, something I've noticed in stories is that, particularly in horror, a lot of directors and a lot of writers will shy away from anything that has to do with child mortality that's used as a plot device in horror. But Stephen King kind of seems to do the opposite of that. He kind of seems to primarily want to use the death of children in his stories. So I understand it as a plot device. It's just a lot to handle sometimes. I mean, and I'm a person who's not even a parent, and it's hard for me to handle it sometimes. So that is something really interesting that I think distinguishes Stephen King from other authors. I've read other Stephen King books where the threat of a child dying was what drove the plot forward, and it worked pretty well. So, I understand the plot device, though. I do understand why he uses this. He also sometimes talks about some of these elements come from just the thought of harm coming to his own children, and the thought of a parent harming their children, and just the horror of that. So, that's something that he's also incorporated into his stories. Continuing with the trend of the fucked up nature of Derry, several people knew that this was going on with these two children, with the father. They might not have known explicitly, but there were some warning signs. There were definitely some things there that told them that something was not right. They saw something, they did nothing, and it kind of goes back to the same chapter where that guy gets killed by those guys who were harassing him for his sexuality. People around were aware that this was going on and just chose to not do anything. One of the worst things about human beings is their predisposition for the bystander effect, where people know things are going on and they don't want to be the one to break that social whatever it is that's keeping them from doing anything, so they just choose to ignore it. Or another thing about people is they'll say something like, I can't do anything about this, I just can't be bothered, I mean, if I do something, then, everything, all those excuses people give. And I think this would be a good time to mention this. I've taken psychology classes that have to do with just human personality and social psych. If you see something going on and no one is saying anything, if you are that person who speaks up, then people are programmed to also speak up, okay? So, because there's a great chance that everybody else, or a good portion of them, are thinking exactly what you are. And if you're that person who speaks up and says something, other people will speak up too. So, you maintaining silence and waiting for someone else to do it is not going to do anything. So, that's just my little 2 cents for the day. But this chapter does very heavily tap into how people actually are, and how people ignore things, and especially when people are silent about things because it goes against the social norm. So even the people who might be in a situation or a place like this city, like Derry, who don't agree with these kinds of things, their voices are suppressed because of how everybody else is. And that actually kind of happens in this chapter because, there is a teacher who thought that, hey, this isn't right. But the principal, and by extension probably that school corporation, were just telling her, hey, shut up, don't say anything. We don't need that kind of bad publicity. So that's just something interesting about this that reflects how humanity actually is, unfortunately. Sometimes the way people are is more horrifying than any supernatural scares you could put into a book. And I did say this writing was kind of reflective of how people actually are, and I also said that in this chapter when someone says something, they get suppressed, and that happens sometimes. I think both are true. I think this is kind of going more off of the latter, but you can't deny there's something about Derry that's not exactly normal, but I do think that normally in these kinds of situations, people would be on your side if you make enough noise, and if people are aware of what you're doing and what you're reporting on. This is also, the story I have to keep in mind takes place during the 1950s, probably when being an abusive parent was not met with the same amount of social backlash that it is now. Because I think back then a certain level against violence was against children was just seen as normal, and it's not normal. And it should never be something that parents do. Parents should never harm their kids. Parents should never hit their kids. I could show you studies on that. But back then, this was something that was much more commonplace, probably. So that has something to do with it, too. Oh, and as I said, Derry is a fucked up place. It doesn't make anything right in that circumstance, but I at least understand why it would have been more likely to happen at that time. So at that point, we flash forward to the story of Mike Hanlon, who is going back to the park where the events of last night just took place, and it's the first day of summer vacation. This takes place right after the previous day, where we followed Ben around for a little while. So anyway, he goes there and he smells this fishy smell, and he sees this foam and blood on the ground. I don't know if he sees foam actually, but he does see some stuff on the ground. And it's blood, and there are tracks. And he's kind of wondering what's going on, and he knows that the boy just went missing, and he doesn't say anything, which is really interesting to me. This is a kid who's got a good relationship with his father, and yet he doesn't say anything about this. And if you recall, Mike Hanlon is the one who ended up making the phone calls to the 6 friends. So we know that he eventually did get good on reporting things because he became a librarian and a researcher. So he became a person who's really good at that. And also, there's another thing he didn't say anything about that we get a flashback about that happened earlier. And it happened, it said, the previous spring. So, in this story, we get a little slice of Mike's life with his father. Now, his father is, I think, some kind of farmer or something, and he has a great relationship with him. They're very poor, but they are very good together, and I really like that. I like that writing. It seemed like something that would happen back then. You know, you hear about kids going out and playing and parents not being as concerned about whether things are as safe as we think of things nowadays. And you know, the dad like has him helping him push the truck around, and it's got like no windshield, and he's like, "Hey, go play out in this field for a while, see what you find, and I'll talk to you about it when I get home." So you know, but you know, that was great writing. It was pretty charming. So the dad sends him out to this field, and we find out this field was the same field where the factory blew up a while back, and all those children were killed in the explosion. And he's going around and just kind of walking on stuff. It says he's aware of the fact that he could fall and cut himself on various things, or he could, you know, just get hurt in a lot of ways. But he's being as cautious as he can, and he sees this big, halfway buried smokestack, and he wants to look in there, but he knows that the ground might crumble under him, and he might fall in there. He's thinking about this bird that he saw from this movie, this like horror picture, and he's just thinking about this, and he looks in there, and he sees a giant bird. And to make a long story short, this bird nearly kills him. He has this big long encounter with it where it chases him around, and it's a huge bird, and he throws these pieces of cement at it, and he, you know, hits it and knocks its eyes out, and there's like these little worm things crawling underneath its eye. And he just ends up besting this bird. But it almost gets him. It chases him down into into something, like a tunnel, and he has to go back far enough where it can't get to him, and it realizes it's going in, and he defeats it by smashing rocks against it. So, once again, Mike doesn't say anything to his father. It's very odd. I don't really know why that is, but something seemed to be pulling him in when he saw the bird. And another thing, whatever this is seems to take the form of whatever the person fears the most. Because when Eddie's younger brother came after him, he saw him as he imagined him, with his head beaten with a hammer, which is what happened to him. And then this thing, and then it took the form of the creature from the Black Lagoon, and now Mike is seeing this bird thing, and he was thinking about a creepy bird. So this creature seems to take the form of whatever they fear the most. And I'm thinking to myself, where have I seen that before? I could go into full detail about that, but that would be ridiculous. Anyway. Another thing I need to point out is it is getting very difficult to keep track of who all these characters are, because we have the main six, and also we have other characters that we are trying to keep track of, and we have to keep track of what their adult counterparts did and what their adult counterparts of themselves did and what they did as children. So that's getting pretty difficult. It's getting even more difficult for me because I am listening to the audiobook and I'm not seeing these names on paper. So, that's something I have trouble with in some Stephen King books, but not others. I actually just read a book not too long ago by Stephen King that had a lot more characters in it, and I didn't get them mixed up nearly as much as I'm getting these characters mixed up. So, interesting thing there. So anyway, we cut back to Mike at the edge of the canal, and weird things are happening. He thinks he sees something in one of the pipes. He thinks he sees some of the foam come together and form what looks like a kid's face screaming, and he throws his knife in there into the Kandusky, and it splashes, but then he thinks he hears a second splash, and he thinks he hears something coming for him. So he just gets on his bike and he pedals away. And that's the end of the chapter. Something really odd is that a lot of these scares are good, but if you read the beginning of the book, which I assume you would have if you're reading this chapter, although there might be exceptions, if you've read the beginning of the book, you know that these people survived this. So I'm hoping they're not going to rely too heavily on the scares of, will they die? Because obviously, if this takes place when they're children, and it starts when they're adults, obviously they survive. But I still thought some of the scares were good. And, the scares with the unknown characters at this point are almost becoming more scary. I mean, this is the issue with prequels and anything where you're going back in time. you're going to a different story, but you kind of know what the conclusion is going to be, so you have to be careful how you plan the suspense. I think Stephen King does it really good most of the time. It's just some of the time, we know that they're not going to get majorly hurt, or they're not going to get killed. So, anyway, overall, I like this chapter. Another slice of the pie, seeing what happens. So, I'm curious for the next chapter, and if you like this video, be sure to like this video and subscribe, because I will be making more content like this. I am planning much more content. I am planning some cool content that, hey, has to do with philosophy. Some actual philosophy videos on my philosophy channel called Our Philosophy Is. Yes, I'll have some of those coming out, and I'll have other things coming out, including more Stephen King stuff. So if you like that, be sure to like that and leave a comment, because I would love to hear your lovely thoughts. Until then, I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye.